itself without referencing any other project. I'm going to pause there again to see if there's any other questions based upon all that information. And hearing none, I'll skip back around and talk about the methods of financing for just a moment, because Brock, in his own presentation, talked about the difference between GO bonds and lease rental bonds. And so, just again to highlight just the general categories that we look at, where ICE Miller would typically come in is on the bottom two, which is why they're highlighted in a little bit slightly higher bold. Guess I could have done a better job with that. But general obligation bonds and lease rental bonds are typically where we come into play to render a bond counsel opinion. Those are paid out of the debt service fund. Another option that's available to you that comes through the state is a common school fund loan. So that would involve us, but that's a mechanism for borrowing that is available to you. And then obviously it's a rarity, but if you have the cash, you can just do it that way out of your operations. And then energy savings loans can also be paid out of operations. I know with Delphi, one thing that was undertaken last year was you guys, you had that loan taken out in 2017 for energy savings. And at that time, it was paid out of operations, which meant that it didn't have any additional process that had to occur. But that was something else that we accomplished last year. Was we had some notice and hearing to the public that then allowed that going forward to be payable out of debt service to then relieve some pressure on the operations fund. So going forward, as Brock noted in his presentation, the energy savings loans now can be paid out of debt service strictly because we went through that notice and hearing process and made the public aware of that. So I have a little picture chart here of what a GO bond looks like. It's very straightforward, and it's a lot simpler than the lease rental bonds, which I'll talk about in just a second. It's straightforward. The school corporation is the issuer of the bonds. School corporation gets the proceeds and they do the construction work. The big downside is that you're subject to a constitutional debt limitation, which is why Brock was talking about, if you are talking about projects of certain dollar thresholds, that may exceed your constitutional debt limitation, which would mean the vehicle would then become the lease financing mechanism. And that formula is your net AV divided by 3 times 2%. And so, Brock, I may have you in the background. I'm sure you have the numbers. If you might be able to chime in a few moments on what Delphi's current GO capacity is. I won't put you on the spot, but whenever you have that. So it's a direct obligation to the school corporation. It's fewer steps, it's cheaper, it's quicker. But obviously you use up your debt capacity. The best analogy I can come up with is that it's kind of like a line of credit. So you have your figure in the aggregate that's based upon that formula, and then you always have to subtract off your existing pension debt, if you have any, and then your existing GO bond debt, which right now we have some. We have those taxable GO bonds of 2020, for example. Common school fund loans incidentally don't count towards this, but you're always kind of drawing against that maximum number. That also means that every time you make a payment semi-annually, your capacity to issue additional GO bonds increases. So every payment date, Brock and his team is doing a calculation on how much more capacity you have in any given year.
Yeah, Eric, the GO capacity as of today is approximately 592,000.
Okay. So in other words, if you right now wanted to do a GO bond issue, you'd be capped at that $592,000 figure, which obviously would severely hamper how much you could get accomplished with GO bonds. So, then the question is, what do we do if we don't have the constitutional debt capacity? Then the mechanism is the lease financing. It's widely used throughout the state of Indiana, been blessed by the Indiana Supreme Court for 80 plus years. And most recently, Delphi Community School Corporation undertook this in 2019 to do about a $4.3 million bond issue. And then your refunding this past year in 2020 was a refunding of an existing lease financing. So it was kind of like refinancing a mortgage. You just save debt service by reissuing bonds at a lower interest rate. So the chart here is obviously a lot more complex. You have a building corporation, which is a nonprofit entity that is established under Indiana state law. They are actually the issuer of the bonds. The building corporation at closing is the entity that receives the money. It's not the school corporation. So it's held under a trust indenture with a trustee bank who has fiduciary duty to hold those funds for specific purposes, namely construction renovation purposes. And so then the building corporation is the owner of the building. They lease it back to the school corporation through a lease agreement. And then the lease agreement is the way that the debt service payments get used to pay bondholders. So it's more complex of a structure, but the biggest benefit is that there's not subject to your debt limit. There's no limitation on how much you can issue as a lease financing. So it takes more time. It involves a lease, it involves a mortgage, it involves real estate descriptions, it involves a second entity. So there's a lot more documentation that goes into a lease financing, and therefore it's typically more expensive overall. Not extremely more expensive, but just more expensive than a GO bond.
Eric, I know there's no debt limit, but typically on the leasing corps, is that subject to our value of our buildings and stuff like that, or is that a risk that they take on to help us out on projects?
Could you repeat the question one more time? I apologize. I had a little trouble hearing that one.
Yep, that's fine. So on the leasing finance, there's no debt limit. So how much, is it based off our value of our buildings and stuff? Is that what it's based off of? And is that up to their discretion on what we can and can't borrow through or lease through?
I see. Really at the end of the day, what buyers of bonds look for and what they really view as a security is your semi-annual debt service payments. So it is true that there is a mortgage on a facility in a lease financing, and that the mortgage technically is collateral to a bondholder. However, I would say, and this is just me speaking on an assumption of what bondholders look for when they look for Indiana school paper. They're not really concerned about the value of a portion of Delphi Elementary School. They look at everything else in your debt picture, and this is why the S&P bond rating matters, because they look at your finances as a school corporation and say, how solvent and how strong are they, and they rate the bonds, and investors buy the bonds based upon those ratings. So at the end of the day, yes, it is true that there's a mortgage on those buildings, but that's not really what drives the amount that you have available to issue. Really, what the amount that you have available to issue is what you are legally able to derive out of debt service. And that's obviously all rate-based, as you just go back and picture Brock's presentation of that blue and green bar graph. As comfortable as you're going, as comfortable as whatever max rate you are comfortable with is what you'd have the ability to issue. Hopefully that answered that question. So that's all I have on the front of construction, right? So we talked about the project thresholds and the processes, and then really the two different types of characteristics of borrowings that we can do, with lease financing being the more common one. If there's no other questions on that front, I will switch gears and talk for a brief moment about an operating referendum and its process. And it's frankly, it's quite simple relative to anything construction related.
Eric, while you're pulling that up, we have not heard back from S&P. Are we due to be reviewed again in terms of our credit rating, or is that up to them?
I may pass the torch back to Brock on that one, because he may have more info on whether you guys are due. I know even when you're not in the midst of a bond issue, they will do occasional surveillance. And I'm not sure when the last surveillance call took place. We typically only hop on those calls when you're in the midst of a bond issue.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Mr. Ronk. So even though last year we pursued what's called a programmatic rating, where we relied upon the rating of the state of Indiana Intercept program for that AA plus rating opposed to what is more directly the individual school corporation's rating of an underlying rating. So even though we pursued a programmatic rating last year, there was still some analysis done. So the last time S&P looked under the hood, so to speak, was last January when we issued those taxable GEOs. So it's been approximately a year. They look at and try to analyze based upon what you just heard from Mr. Long. They try to look at and prepare a surveillance rating annually about every year. So based upon the fact that we had that rating conducted for the programmatic rating about a year ago, they're analyzing and reviewing as you submit your Form 9, but they will only reach out to you if they think you are a candidate to have any impact to your rating. So I would say no less than every other year, but no more than every year will they look at it and kick the tires on a rating.
Okay. Thank you.
So again, just to kind of re-summarize and reiterate on the construction side, we do have a simpler process if it's considered a non-controlled project. There's no clipboard race, there's no waiting period for referendum or anything of that nature. So if we're below that threshold, it's a lot simpler process, and that's what a lot of folks choose to go through. It gets obviously a little bit more complicated when you're talking about anything above those certain thresholds. But either way, you're talking about all in 2 or 3 board meetings worth of approvals. We have a phase where we're going through the offering document, talking to a rating agency, et cetera. So, all in about a 6-month process from start to finish, maybe a little bit less. And in contrast, when you're talking about an operating referendum, I'm going to pull the timetable up here. For the most part, from your perspective, it's pretty simple and straightforward. The law only requires that you, the school board, adopt a resolution that essentially says that you cannot carry out your public education duties unless you impose a referendum tax levy. And then I'll just kind of quickly scroll through these remaining steps. It's really all up to other parties, and I say that just because the timing is a little bit outside of your control, and so we typically recommend not waiting until the last minute to go on a ballot. So for example, if you were choosing to go on a November ballot, because of all these steps that have to take place before, well before Election Day, we would probably recommend your initial adoption of a resolution May, perhaps June, because then that would allow all the additional steps to take place where you certify a resolution to the Department of Local Government Finance. They can take up to 10 days to review what you want the public question to look like. One of the things they do by statute is they look for bias. So the wording of your public question is supposed to be such that it's not supposed to be swaying the community in favor of a vote, for example, but strictly is more factual based. And then in turn, once it's approved, then you got to go back and take your certifications back to the county clerk and back to your county election board, and then give them time to conduct their meeting to go officially approve the ballot language that actually does appear on your ballot. So those are all the steps, but I just wanted to highlight that really the only direct action that has to be taken to work towards an operating referendum is to conduct a meeting in which you pass one resolution with certain language regarding your educational duties.
This needs to be done or put on the general or primary right, and so it'd be in 2022.
Correct. So if you win a referendum in year 1, you can start collecting the increased tax dollars in year 2 and beyond. So if you won an operating referendum in 2021, you could start collecting tax dollars in 2022.
So does that go to election, right?
I'm sorry?
That would have to go to election, so we will not have an election in 2021. So unless we did a special paid for it, right? We need to wait.
Right, and frankly, so technically you could go in 2021, but you'd have to pay for it, right? So that goes back to the fact that there's no other elections occurring in this calendar year. So you would have to open up all the precincts, pay all the workers, et cetera, and that would come as a cost to the school corporation. I would also highlight that now, given that we're in mid-February, because of all the steps that have to occur, and because of all the steps that have to occur between 60 and 75 days before Election Day, you actually were probably already pushing way too close to be able to do it at a May primary. It would basically be in November of 21. So you could potentially still conduct an election in November of 21 where you'd be the only question on the ballot and you would pay for the election. In contrast, if you waited until 22, as the law stands right now, you could wait and be on a May primary or be in the November general, and because other questions and other elections are occurring and the precincts are open anyway and all the county officials are working through those anyway, you would not have any additional cost to be on that ballot in 2022.
Eric, what has the greater success rate of being in a May primary or November general?
Generally speaking, one, operating referendum questions are slightly more successful than construction referendum questions, and generally speaking, November elections are slightly more successful than May elections. I don't know that we have the data on why. My own speculation would be just that you have a larger voter base that's out there, and that perhaps there are more people who are directly either for or against you, to the extent there are fewer questions and fewer voters out there.
Thank you.
And then one other thing I'll highlight, if you guys can see this text in blue, is that the form of the question is highly prescribed by statute, that it has to be worded a certain way. So I've just got the maximum of 8 calendar years there as the placeholder. You have to also talk about what rate you are going to seek. So it is a rate-based question. And that's important because to the extent your AV is increasing, like Brock said, every year, if your AV is increasing, you can actually collect more dollars at the end of the day because you're talking about the same rate applied to a higher overall assessed valuation. And then the last piece is just that the purpose of the funding is where you put your description, and that's where you're given a little bit of leeway, but that's also the part that the DLGF reviews for bias. Now that being said, just in our experience of just over 10 years of being a referendum state, there have been some things that we've been able to work with the DLGF on putting in that is kind of favorable, just not blatantly biased. I'll go ahead and stop sharing that. But obviously, I'm glad to answer any other questions on the construction or the operating side.
Any other questions?
No.
Do the text that in, if he does.
Eric, is it safe to assume that since we have a building that combines middle school and high school, that's a one project kind of thing? It would be,
With one consolidated building, probably yes.
okay.
Questions for Eric or Brock? All right.
I couldn't.
Anything else for us?
No, thanks for the opportunity. Happy to come back as needed and present any revisions your team may want.
Yeah, in between mounds of snow and a pandemic, I'd love to come back up there to see you in person, but thanks for accommodating us via Zoom this evening.
Well, we appreciate both of you doing what you've done in the past as well as now, and being on Zoom and updating. I know there's a lot of great information here, and as we go forward, it'll definitely going to help us to look at what we can do and the bigger scope of things, and instead of just GeoBond and everything to death. So I think that will definitely help. Mr. Ronke, anything?
Now, again, thank you very much. I appreciated working with you and all the help you provided since I've been here. It's been fantastic.
Well, nothing else. Work session's over. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Have a good night.
Appreciate it. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.